Today we're going to be talking about midpoint formula. First of all, let's talk about what is a midpoint. So our prefix here is mid, which tells us we're talking about something that has to do with the middle. And our root word is point, which means that we are trying to find a middle point. And so the midpoint is going to be exactly in the middle of a line segment. So let's take a closer look. The very first day of our new chapter, chapter 1, we talked about lines, and we said that lines go on forever and ever. So it's important that you know that you can't find the midpoint of a line, because you can't find the midpoint of infinity. There's no such thing. So when we see something like our top picture here, if they're asking you to find the midpoint, they will draw points on here, and they will probably name them. So we'll give them a name A and B. And if they're asking you to find the midpoint, they're going to name this middle section. And we need a way to distinguish. How do I know? Are they talking about the line AB, right, which we said we would name with 2 capital letters and the arrows at the end, or line with arrows at the end? That's not very pretty. Okay. Or are they talking about the line segment, which is just a piece of the line here? So when we're talking about the line segment, they're going to name it still using 2 letters, but they're just going to put a straight line over it. They're not going to have the arrows at the end. Okay? They might also draw it more like this bottom picture. And so if we called this one CD, same thing. This is a line segment, so it just gets a line, no arrows over it. And you need to know that on the second picture, it still is a piece of a line. So there's still a line out there that continues on forever and ever. We've just decided that for this problem, that extra line is just a distraction. It's not important, so you don't have to draw it on there. I just want you to know it does still exist because this is a piece of a line. Okay? So let's take a look at the actual formula. Okay, and I've set us up an example as well. And so this is our formula over here. Okay, so it is the midpoint is equal to x1 plus x2 over 2. And this midpoint formula is for a number line. Okay, so when you're writing this into your notes, you need to be sure you write this one down for a number line. In a minute, we'll talk about how to find midpoint when you're dealing with a graph. Okay, where you have the x and the y axis. Okay, but this is just for a number line. Okay. So let's try plugging in some numbers and identifying what is, what are our x1, x2, how are we going to find those? Those are usually the first questions I get. So when we look up here and we see we have A is at -3, and we have B is at 1, and we want to know which of these is x1 and which one is x2. And the truth is, it doesn't matter. You just have to decide. Most people go in alphabetical order. I think that's just habit, but it really and truly does not matter. Okay, it's the same midpoint either way. So when we're looking at this, we are just going to plug these numbers into this formula. So we have x1 is -3, so we're going to have -3 plus 1, which is what x2 was, and then this is all divided by 2. It's important to remember that this is a plus sign here in the middle, because what we're actually doing is we're finding the average, because when you find the average of 2 numbers, that's exactly the center of those 2 numbers. So that's what we're doing. And so on here, if we have -3 plus 1, that's going to be -2. This is over 2. And when we reduce that, it will be -1. And remember that if you have a hard time with your negatives, you are welcome to use a calculator for this. To be perfectly honest, you can type in using your fraction feature this part here, and it will solve the whole thing. Because what I'm interested in at this point is, can you figure out which numbers go in the formula and which spot do they need to go in? Okay. So next we're going to look at an example on a graph. Okay, so here is our formula for finding midpoint on a graph. And you're going to notice that this first part, okay, is exactly the same as what we just did on a number line. And all we've done is we've copied the exact same thing and we've substituted out the x's for y's. Okay? And that's our second part. And the reason for that is because on a number line, we only have one axis that we're dealing with. That's the number line. On a graph, we have an x and a y axis, and so we have we have 2 points, and they are both going to have an x and a y coordinate. So we're going to find the mean of both of those, and that will give us our midpoint. So I've set us up an example here, and we're first going to identify the coordinates. And so if we count these, you'll see that S is at coordinate -6, 3, and T is at coordinate 1, 0. Okay? And we can label these. We already know they're going to have an x coordinate and a y coordinate. This is going to have an x coordinate and a y coordinate, and those are always alphabetical on there. Okay, so that'll help you remember which one goes first and which one goes second. And then we have to have these little 1s and 2s like they've got listed over here. There's a 1 and a 2 for the x's and a 1 and 2 for the y's. And so, again, it doesn't matter which one you choose to be the 1s and which ones you choose to be the 2s. Just like when we did distance formula, you just have to set one set are the 1s and then the other set are the 2s. Okay? So I decided for this one, for me, that the S coordinate is going to be the 1 coordinate. Okay, so it gets x1 and y1. And T is going to be the 2 coordinate, so it gets x2 and y2. Okay, so we're going to practice plugging these into our formula. Okay, and then we're going to solve. Okay, so for our midpoint, we're going to start off, we're going to plug in our x's. So we have our x1 over here is -6. So we're going to plug that in. And then our x2 coordinate is 1. So we're going to plug that in. Okay. And that's over 2. Okay. And then for our y coordinates, we have y1 is 3. And y2 is 0. And notice that they're both divided by 2 because we're dividing those in half, because we want to find the midpoint. So we're going to solve each of these individually, and what we're going to get at the end is an ordered pair, and that's going to be our midpoint. So we have -6 plus 1 is going to be -5 divided by 2. And we have 3 plus 0 is still 3, and that's divided by 2. And you're going to notice that both of these are odd numbers, so we can't actually divide them any smaller and so without getting a decimal. And so you're welcome to leave them like this. If it's easier for you to go and identify them on the graph as a decimal, you're welcome to go ahead and turn those into a decimal. In this case, you would get, you would get -2.5 for our first coordinate. And for the second coordinate, you would get +1.5, so it would be 1.5. And if you were to go and graph this, we would go back 2.5 spaces and up 1.5 spaces, and that's approximately right here, right? So X marks the spot, and that is the midpoint of that line. Now, it's always a good idea to graph it because you can see here, it looks like both of these are pretty well cut, exactly in half. If you had gotten some number where your point had been over here, right, or if you had gotten a number up here, you would know that you made a mistake, probably with a sign, and that you would need to go back and double check those. Sign errors are the most common mistakes on here. So if you can make sure you get them plugged in, you're welcome to type in each half of this, like this part here, and then this part here. You have to type them in separately, but you could type them into your fraction feature on your calculator and solve them just to be sure that you get the right number at the end. Okay? Next, we have another term, and that term is what we call a segment bisector. And you can find it in your book if you're interested. It should be on page 27, but we need to talk about what a bisector is, because that term is a math term that's going to show up several times. So we know that the prefix bi here means 2, and sector means that we have divided it into parts. And so when we talk about a segment bisector, it's really going to be the same thing as a midpoint in a lot of cases, because we're talking about finding the middle of a line. But it can also be, instead of just a point, right, midpoint has to be a point, it could also be a line that cuts another line in half. So if we're saying this half here and this half here are the same, they're the same length, and this line, okay, or line segment, or it could be a ray, cuts the other line in half, then that line would be a segment bisector. Right? So this would be an example of a segment bisector. It could also be, if you have a line segment and it's cut in half by a ray, right, like this, okay, we know that this half and this half are the same, then we know that this ray, right here, is also a segment bisector. So the segment bisector will cut a segment in half exactly at its midpoint. I really appreciate you listening, and I hope you have a lovely evening, and I will see you tomorrow in class. Thank you.